So what was interesting about Camp Amache was that in Colorado they had initiated what is known as the Project Farm, and this was the largest employer of evacuees at the center, and they produce a lot of the vegetable crops. And if you recall, Japanese Americans were quite successful sort of farmers in the state of California, and their skills and their talents were utilized in Colorado's Project Farm, and they were able to basically produce all kinds of farm products. And local farmers were very much impressed with Japanese Americans, not only willingness, but also their talents. In 1943, for instance, the Amachi farm was valued at 190,000 with a cost of production less than 50,000. So they were able to generate a significant amount of surplus from their operations. And sugar beet farmers, for instance, were especially asked the evacuees for help, harvested more than 65,000 tons of sugar beets in the state of California. Of course, sugar beets during this time was a very important product. Unfortunately, however, some of the local responses, mainly coming from politicians as well as news outlets, did not particularly sort of support the establishment of the internment camps and the arrival of the Japanese Americans in their midst. And there were various sort of reactions, and that those reactions ranged from flat out rejection to some warm reception. So Denver Post, for instance, bitterly protested the presence of Japanese Americans. Lamar Daily, a Greatest War related project Colorado has received, and Rocky Mountain News and the Monitor view the evacuees favorably. But the general public opinion at the time was very much against the evacuees at Amache. Merchants refused to sell merchandise to them. There were signs utilizing really sort of negative language in reference to Japanese Americans were posted in various places. There were rumors still circulating about the evacuees holding best informants in Colorado, which of course was not accurate. If you can think about the circumstances behind Japanese Americans working on this project, right? So during the day, they will come out of their internment camps, go on to these farmlands, and then produce all kinds of goods for mostly white American farmers. And then in the evening time, they will return to their internment camps, and not very different from prison labor. A lot of the prisoners go outside of their prison complex and work on various sort of projects. In a similar way, the Japanese Americans during this time period were allowed to go outside to work on the farmlands. Ralph Carr was the governor of the state of Colorado at that time. He was one of the sort of principled politicians who actually very much supported the Japanese American in Colorado, but also he was outraged by the constitutional sort of violation of putting Japanese Americans in internment camps. So he was very much a supporter of Japanese Americans. He was elected into office in 1939. In 1943, his term ended, but because of his unswerving sort of support of the internees, he had to sort of experience political backlash because the popular opinion, as I mentioned, was very much against the Japanese Americans. And because of his support, he lost the next election in November of 1943 during the height of the World War II, and when Japanese Americans were still housed in internment camp in Camp Amachi. I have a quote here that I would like to share with you. He said, "If you harm them, the Japanese Americans, you must harm me. I was brought up in a small town where I knew the shame and dishonor of race hatred. I grew to despise it because it threatened the happiness of you and you and you." And so he articulated this idea that when one person in your community is violated by the government, when their rights are upheld, suspended for whatever reasons, then it also threatens the rights as well as basically the constitutional rights that you have as a citizen, because you never know when the government is going to come after you, right? And so I think it's important to recognize the fact that all of our collective rights are tied, bound up together, right? And that's the sentiment that he was trying to sort of communicate in his public speech. Okay, so there were three individuals in particular who contested the constitutionality of the three military orders, right? The curfew, evacuation, and internment order. And they are Minoru Yatsui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu, right? So Minoru Yatsui was the first to contest and the constitutionality of the internment. He was a second lieutenant reserve army officer prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. You know, it was interesting that he argued that the military had violated the basic sort of rights of the not only Japanese Americans but other Americans as well. The idea of having to stay home after 8 p.m. was something that did not sit well with Minoru Yasui. He was convicted in the district court in Portland for knowingly disregarding restrictions. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail, and $5,000 fine was imposed upon him. He appealed in the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit Court, and his case was forwarded to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1943, June 21st. The Supreme Court decided. He argued that the evacuation came out of the Executive Order 9066. The thing that struck me immediately was that the military was ordering the civilian to do something. And in his opinion, that's the way dictatorships are formed. And if I, as an American citizen, stood still for this, I would be derogating the rights of all citizens. My God, I had to stand up and say, that's wrong. I refuse to report for evacuation. Sure enough, within the week, I got a telephone call from the military police saying, we're coming to get you. I was thrown into the North Portland Livestock Pavilion where Japanese Americans had been put. In September, they started moving us into the desert camps. You were surrounded with barbed wire fences. There were armed guards, searchlights, and machine gun nests. We wondered how long we were going to be there. What was going to happen? No one knew. By then, we had heard rumors of forced labor camps in Germany. Were they indeed, as Westbrook Pegler and others were suggesting, going to castrate the men and ship them back to Japan? These things were in the paper constantly. Make them suffer, make them hurt. You're thinking, what did I do, right? What did I do wrong? Okay. So that was Minoru Yatsui. Minoru Yatsui actually was from Colorado. And in later, after the U.S. Supreme Court decided on his case, the Japanese American communities in Denver decided to erect a bust of Minoru Yasui in the Sakura Square in Denver. Gordon Hirabayashi was another person from Seattle. He was a sociology major. He was actually studying law at the time and later would become a sociology professor. He too was irate over the military as well as the US government telling him what to do in times of military sort of necessity or emergency. And he also saw through the contradictions of the government policies that had singled out Japanese Americans for those military proclamations. He came from a very interesting background. His parents were really peace-loving sort of people. They were sort of like the Quakers of East Coast. They were Christians. They were non-denominational, but were very much like who advocated pacifism. and he too inherited some of these sort of principles. But he felt that the government orders were so egregious that he decided to challenge curfew order. And in fact, one of the ways in which one can challenge it is if you have been wronged by the government. What that means is that you have to be arrested, right? And he was arrested based on what he perceived as a misguided military proclamation. So what he ended up doing was he actually roamed the streets of Seattle, and nobody took notice. And so he decided to actually pay a visit to the police station. He knocked on the door of the police station and informed the police officers that he was Japanese American. And he also, asked the police officers if they were knowledgeable about the military proclamations, particularly the curfew order, and that he was violating the curfew order. And at which point the police officers arrested Gordon, and he was sent to King County Jail. And then his case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court as well. So Minoru Yatsui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and the third person was Fred Korematsu. All three cases will go straight up to the US Supreme Court. Fred Korematsu was from California in a city called San Leandro, which is just 15 minutes south of Berkeley, Oakland area on the East Bay. He, at the time of the internment order was issued, was engaged actually to a Caucasian woman. And so, that presented peculiar sort of dilemma for him and for his fiance, in that, he was going to be interned, but his fiance, who was Caucasian, was not, right? So he decided to make an attempt to skirt the proclamation by getting a sort of plastic surgery done on his eyes so that he would look more Caucasian, right? Which was unsuccessful, by the way. So eventually he was charged and he was sent to jail, and he in turn charged the government of violating 69 of his sort of rights. And his case, along with Minoru Yatsui, Gordon Hirabayashi, went to US Supreme Court. Aside from the three Japanese Americans who explicitly challenged the constitutionality of the military proclamation, and what's important about their actions is that, it extends beyond Japanese Americans. If similar things were to happen to other Americans, we have a legal precedent now. 40 years later, in 1980, the US Supreme Court would overturn the prior decision, basically claiming that such actions were in egregious violation of the US Constitution, right? So we have that legal precedent. So that's huge. I think that's huge for American history. That's huge for other minorities who may experience similar kinds of misconduct by the US government and mistreatment. So we were able to then expand the rights to all people. We were able to strengthen the foundation of American Constitution. And that's really, quite something. The fact that they were able to stand up for their rights, and also in doing so, they were able to really sort of strengthen the principles inherent in our Constitution. So as I mentioned, a great majority of Japanese Americans responded affirmatively to the American government, and particularly to the US Armed Forces. And they joined the military, all Japanese American military units. They came to be known as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In January of 1943, U.S. War Department formed this segregated unit composed entirely of Nisei second generation Japanese Americans from Hawaii and also from the mainland. Japanese Americans were particularly sort of notorious for their bravery because they felt like they had something to prove. If you can imagine their families locked up still behind barbed wires, and they were being ordered to fight in this war for democracy. They were sent to Italy, as I mentioned, in various other places, and oftentimes they were at the head of the attack. And so they experienced the brunt of counterattacks by the enemy forces. And the 442nd Infantry later on came to be known as the Purple Heart Battalion. A soldier receives a Purple Heart if that soldier is wounded in battle, right? So there were high rate of casualties incurred by the Japanese Americans because they were heading many of these attacks. The Nisei detention camps were drafted, and they also joined the 442nd Infantry in the following January of 1944. They also joined forces with another Japanese American military unit known as the 100th Battalion. They together came to be known as the most decorated unit in US military history for its size and length of service, right? So even though they constituted a minority of military units, they were one of the most sort of bravest units, as well as the unit with the most amount of casualties, right? Over 18,000 individual decorations for bravery, for instance, 9,500 Purple Hearts, and 7 Presidential Distinguished Unit citations. That, I guess, in some ways concludes the Japanese American internment. But what is important for us to remember is the post-traumatic effects of the internment experience among Japanese Americans. The war ends in 1945 with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 atomic bombs carried by Enola Gay that culminated in the end of the war, effectively against Japan. So Japan surrenders, US is victorious, and the war in Europe comes to an end as well, right? So military usage of the military weapons for the first time in human history against a civilian population would effectively end the war. Now, among the Japanese Americans, so immediately after the war, Japanese American communities that were all scattered throughout these internment camps were all of a sudden allowed to go into communities, right? And this was, particularly sort of problematic for a lot of the people because, they had to sell all of their land, their personal properties, their houses, and things like that, right? Many of them felt like they couldn't go back to the communities from which they came because their neighbors and the community people were supporting the internment of Japanese Americans. So they felt really disheartened by their mistreatment during the internment era. So they decided to go to like other communities, but many of them did go back to their original communities and began to farm again. But they maintained a really low sort of key because they felt really shamed by their internment experience. And one of the contributing factors was their ethnic heritage. Being Japanese American was, in their view, the reason for their internment, right? And so for many years, they did not highlight, right, their Japaneseness, right? They wanted to basically melt into American culture and communities without necessarily sort of pointing out their Japanese heritage, right? And this kind of post-traumatic experience will last for many, many years until civil rights movement era when things began to really turn around for better, where they started to sort of embrace their Japaneseness and no longer felt ashamed by their ethnic heritage because they knew that they had done nothing wrong. And it was okay for a person to have pride in their ethnic heritage. That was not a crime. There was nothing wrong in what they did. It was entirely the misdeeds of the government that traumatized the Japanese American communities, right? And so the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s significantly impacted Japanese Americans in particular, but it would also have a huge waves of impacts across the social, political, and economic sort of domains of American society, and also particularly the Asian Americans. And so today, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of civil rights movement on Asian American experience. So one of the profound sort of impacts that the civil rights movement would have on Asian American communities is the Immigration Act of 1965. Well, it's an Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, right? So up to this point in time, we talked about number of exclusionary immigration laws dating back to 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, Immigration Act of 1917, Immigration Act of 1924. All of these immigration acts had deleterious effects on various Asian immigrant populations, right? We wanted to basically guard American society from the onslaught of Asian immigrants, even though the actual number of Asian immigrants coming into the United States was only a fraction compared to other immigrants that were coming into the United States. Only tens of thousands of people, whereas immigrants coming from Europe, for instance, were in their millions. The Immigration Exclusion Acts were in place against various Asian ethnic groups until 1965. And also in regards to naturalization, we also talked about the significance of the 1790 Naturalization Act that only allowed free white persons to become naturalized citizens. And that law would undergo an amendment in 1870, shortly after the Civil War, giving naturalization rights to persons of African nativity, right? So after 1870, you had to be either black or white in order to become naturalized citizens. And throughout the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th centuries, all immigrant populations had to contend with black and white tests for naturalization rights. Various Asian ethnic groups attempted, I think unsuccessfully, to make that kind of race-based argument, right? We talked about Ozawa and Thind, but there were actually a number of other cases of various Asian ethnic populations that attempted to pass the race test by making all kinds of cultural and legalistic and anthropological arguments. They were all unsuccessful, and Asian populations in the United States could not become naturalized citizens until 1965, when it would repeal the 1790, 1870 naturalization laws that were based on the criteria of race. This was huge. This was a monumental change with respect to Asian American experience. So what did the 1965 Immigration Act stipulate? I'm not going to go into all of the political developments leading up to 1965. I share some of that in the slides here, but I'm not going to be able to talk about each of those things in the interest of saving some time. Another law that needs to be mentioned is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This was also, in addition to the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, one of the most sort of historic legislation that was ever passed in American history. So it's very important for you to have a solid understanding of what this act was. So basically, this was a law that would outlaw discrimination in hotels, in public accommodations, and it would also encourage desegregation of public schools, also authorize federal funds for programs to end or stem the tide of discrimination, outlawed employment discrimination, etc. This was a law that basically prohibited discrimination by state municipality or local municipalities or federal government that receive federal funds. So, public school systems, public K through 12, as well as higher education that receive federal funds, and also in the employment sector as well. They cannot any longer discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, and later on, they would include sex, sexual orientation, right? So these are tremendous movement forward in terms of guaranteeing the rights of variously marginalized populations in American history and experience, right? So any of violations that get contested in the court of law, they will look at 1964 Civil Rights Act as a foundational document to support the legal rights of people who may have been wronged by the government, right? So along with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, they will also rely upon the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, where it says that everyone should be treated equally under the law. So when someone is discriminated against, they are being mistreated by the government, they are likely going to violate the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So those two pieces of legislation are very important if you are interested in understanding the rights that guarantee to all people, the society, and particularly the society's most vulnerable sort of populations. 1965, we also reaffirmed the right of American citizens to be able to cast a ballot. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was instituted as a way of overcoming some of the indirect methods to prohibit and prevent poor people as well as racial minorities from participating in the political process, particularly in the Deep South. So a lot of the places had imposed poll taxes, and there were other methods by which these populations were systematically prohibited from casting a vote, right? And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 attempted to eliminate some of these loopholes that had been in existence for very, very long time, since the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed way back in the 1860s, right? And so from 1870 to 1965, various sort of racialized populations could not fully exercise their voting rights. And some people would argue that even after 1965, some communities are still affected negatively by the state government's effort to, I think, in some ways indirectly prohibit some eligible voters from actually voting, right? And so this is a continuing, ongoing sort of issue for us today. So it's not, the history hasn't concluded. We still have to contend with the fact that, not all Americans who are eligible to vote are actually participating meaningfully in the political process. The 1965 Immigration Act would establish a new quota that repealed the 1964 quota system that was really favoring certain populations, right, to the exclusion of Asian populations and other countries as well. But most importantly, I think the Asian populations were excluded from coming into the United States precisely because of the 2% quota system that was enacted in the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1965 Immigration Act would establish a new quota. Uppermost, the cap would be 170,000 immigrant visas for non-Western Hemisphere countries and 120,000 for the Western Hemisphere. And regardless of the size of the country, each country would receive 20,000 maximum per year. And what's interesting is that this would be just immigrant visas. And then there will be other ways in which people would be able to enter the United States. Immigration Act also established the preferential sort of system where if you have dependents who are living in another country, they have first priority in terms of being able to come to the United States through invitation by an immigrant who is already residing in the United States. It may take several months. In some cases, it will take a number of years, over a decade, right? But nonetheless, eventually they would be able to enter the United States through this kind of visitation invitation system. And those who are invited by the relatives are not counted toward their annual 20,000 quota. Presumably, you could have a lot more than 20,000 people from any country coming into the United States. And the Asian countries were perhaps the single most important beneficiary of the 1965 Immigration Act. Latin American countries also benefited tremendously from this act as well. Mexican immigration, for instance, skyrocketed. Although throughout the years, American policy toward Mexico waned and waxed, depending upon the labor needs in American society. So there was a huge, for instance, a bracero program during World War II from 1942 to 1964. And then even prior to that, American government had systematically recruited agricultural, particularly workers from Mexico. And then, we would send them back through the deportation policies. But, the immigration policy would more or less become stabilized after 1965 because we would establish a one system that applied to all countries throughout the world. So after 1965, we began to see some significant changes. Between 1959 and 1968, for instance, there was a significant transition away from Northern and Eastern European immigrants to Southern and Eastern European countries. If you recall, 1924 Immigration Act had targeted not only Asians, but also Southern and Eastern Europeans, right? So after this period of 1965, significant sort of change in terms of the influx of the Southern and Eastern Europeans coming into the United States in greater numbers. Asian immigrants. So in history, we covered, for instance, the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Asian Indians, as well as Filipinos. But this time, after 1965, a significant number of immigrants from other countries, other than those 5 countries that I mentioned, are coming into the United States, right? So a lot of the immigrants coming from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East as well. So those immigrants have outnumbered, in some cases, some of the traditional immigrants coming from Asia. So for instance, right, there are more Vietnamese living in the United States than Japanese Americans, right? Which is a very significant sort of change in terms of ethno-demographic makeup of Asian populations in the United States. I had an entire sort of lecture also prepared for new waves of Asian immigration to the United States, right? Other than those 5 groups, and particularly people who are coming from Southeast Asia. Are you familiar with Southeast Asian immigration to the United States?
Yes, there was
Sure.
conflicts going on in
Yeah.
Vietnam, Laos, and
Uh-huh.
Cambodia.
Yeah, absolutely. Right during the 1960s. Do you know when the war ends, the Vietnam War?
I don't remember. I'm not good with dates.
Yeah, so the war would last for almost a decade. It ends in 1975. So American, thousands, tens of thousands of American troops were deployed in Vietnam. America was not successful. So Vietnam would undergo a major sort of sweeping change. First of all, Americans were at war with the North Vietnam in particular, right? And the person who sort of headed the communist faction of Vietnam at the time was a person by the name of Ho Chi Minh. I don't know if you have heard of Ho Chi Minh. There's a Ho Chi Minh Trail, and there's a Ho Chi Minh as a city, right, in Vietnam today. But he was extremely well educated. He was actually educated in France. And in the 19th century, Vietnam was a colony of France. And it's a part of the Indochine or Indochina, right? Along with a number of other sort of neighboring countries. So colonization, again, would play a significant role in terms of creating these kinds of sort of connections, right? So Ho Chi Minh was a person who was educated in France and became radicalized and adopted this communist ideology. So he became communist in France, and he was one of the sort of contributing founding members of the Communist Party in France. And then he comes back to Vietnam, really excited, right? And he founds the Communist Party and the regime in Vietnam. A couple of decades earlier, similar thing had happened in Korea. There was a person by the name of Kim Il sung, whose grandson is running the country at the moment, who was educated in Russia. So he was radicalized. He became communist through the communist education in Russia. So Americans were really getting nervous about a lot of these Asian countries falling to the forces of the communist regimes. So we wanted to basically establish peace agreements with the various Asian countries, right? And in Korea, for instance, in 1953, immediately after the Korean War, we established a truce. And so basically we said, okay, North Korea, you remain communist. South Korea, we are going to basically take over and turn that country into a democratic system. And this was all part of the, Truman's sort of dominant theory, where he was afraid of if a single country in Asia falls under the hands of the communism, that the rest of Asia will fall into communism, right? And so he wanted to basically strategically establish truce relations with the various countries in Asia by giving some concessions to the communist regime, right? And also allowing pro-democracy American forces to take root in some parts of those areas, right? So we basically arbitrarily divided up the country into North and South. North became communist, South became pro-democratic. Same thing happened with Vietnam. Like Korea, there was a major war between the communist forces and the pro-democracy forces. And unlike Korea, in the Vietnam War, the communist forces basically won out. And in the United States, we could not no longer sort of withstand thousands of American troops coming back home in body bags, right? So there were in the 1960s, the student protests began to basically take over. And a lot of the politicians were experiencing a lot of pressure coming from these students and also from the general public, right? So we decided to withdraw troops from Vietnam, right? And shortly after that, Ho Chi Minh, right, takes over the South Vietnam. Saigon was the capital city of South Vietnam, falls to the hands of Ho Chi Minh, and changes the name from Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City. Millions of people who were now coming under the dictatorial communist rule of Ho Chi Minh wanted to flee the country, right? A lot of, particularly, people, a lot of the people who were, doctors, teachers, who were sort of occupying the upper echelon of the society, were threatened by the takeover by the Communist Party, right? So they wanted to flee the country. So they got on boats, and they had to basically brave the seas. A lot of people perished, trying to go to a neighboring countries of Thailand and other various other countries, right? So they came to be known as the boat people, right? They were trying to frantically sort of leave the country. And witnessing all of this, the American government decided to help them out. So we sent military choppers to airlift thousands of people out of Saigon and the various other cities, right? So this was the Operation Airlift. And American side also decided to pass a law that would allow for these refugees to come to the United States. And this law would be known as the Refugee Act of 1980, that systematically granted resettlement of Vietnamese and also the neighboring countries of Cambodia. Cambodia was taken over by another ruthless communist leader by the name of Pol Pot, who executed thousands of people who were basically teachers, doctors, etc. Right? And there's a very famous sort of movie called Killing Fields that documents the rise of Pol Pot in Cambodia, right? And so all of a sudden, you had millions of people in Southeast Asia who became refugees, and the Americans basically came to their aid through legislation and systematically allowing um, the refugee populations to resettle in the United States. And so they went to places like Long Beach, to Houston, Texas, and then there was a sort of second resettlement in Northeast Asia, Northeast United States, in places like Boston, but also in Minnesota, Wisconsin. There's a significant population of the Hmong people, who are sort of ethnic tribe um, in Thailand, in Laos, in Cambodia, right? They originate from those areas and have resettled in places like Denver, Colorado. So there's a significant Hmong population in Denver, as well as in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, Minnesota as well, right? There's a very famous another movie called that basically talks about the conflict between the recent arrivals from the Hmong tribes and the host populations in St. Paul, Minnesota. So again, you have very interesting sort of twist in history with respect to Asian immigration to the United States. In the post 1965 period, you have a dramatically sort of different populations that are coming into the United States that are both traditional immigrant sort of population, but then you have the refugee population as well, right? So Asian American communities today are incredibly diverse, right? But they still constitute, racially speaking, a small minority. They only constitute only about 6 to 7% of the US population, right? But a lot of the media reports make it seem like they're everywhere, right? But they only represent a small minority, as it has always been the case in US history. I mean, in the 19th century, they only numbered maybe a couple of 100,000, right, out of millions of people that have come. But in the post 1965 period, in the year 2020, they account for maybe around 6.5% of the U.S. population. So U.S. population stands at around 300 and I would say 50 million people. Asian Americans constitute maybe 20 million out of that. Maybe final comment or question before we close the session.
I think it's just interesting how you said that they make Asians, like the Asian population, seem like very large
Mm-hmm.
in the US, which is just fascinating because I even thought that.
Yeah.
myself. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
there's a lot of
Isn't it? Yeah, I mean they're everywhere you think, right? But they're
them.
really a small, minority, and it's all about the perception, how the media kind of frames the issues, and how politicians kind of exploit the difference, right? And especially in these times of emergencies like coronavirus. I mean, President Trump calling it China virus or Kung flu or things like that. I don't think those things will kind of help appease the relations between various ethnic populations in the United States. It will only sort of worsen anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiments, leading to violence and I think bad relations, generally speaking, between Asian Americans and other populations. And so I think perception versus reality is something that we need to keep in mind.